Today I wanted to share a study on Ezekiel 20, focusing on verses 33 to 38, which are often used to teach a second Exodus. I was going to include this passage in another teaching that I'm currently working on, but because of the depth and detail in this passage, I felt it really deserved its own video. I did mention Ezekiel 20 in a previous video that I did last year, but I have studied it deeper since then, so I just wanted to share this study with you all and hear your thoughts. So like I said, Ezekiel 20 is often used to teach the idea of a second Exodus, where people believe that we will all be gathered into a desert-like wilderness to be tested, and that the rebels will be purged out while only the righteous remain and enter the promised land. So many teachings present this basically as kind of like an exact repeat of the Exodus from Egypt, but just on a larger scale. So it will be a gathering of all people from all corners of the world instead of from one place like the Israelites in Egypt. So today I want to share a different perspective with you that you probably haven't heard before. And I really hope that you stay with me until the end of the video before you disagree or, form any conclusions. Alright, so before we get into the verses, it's important to understand that Scripture describes more than one gathering at the end of the age. The end is going to be a harvest. As Yahushua himself said, the harvest is the end of the world. There's going to be a gathering of the righteous, both dead and alive, from the four corners of the earth. We can see this in Isaiah 11:12 and Matthew 24:31. There's the gathering of the wicked. So that's when all of the nations assemble against Yahushua at the Battle of Armageddon. And we see that in Revelation 16:16 and Zechariah 14:2. And then there's the gathering of the survivors of the nations. So these are the ones who survive Yah's wrath, and they will stay alive and still be alive in their fleshly, mortal bodies. At the start of the millennial reign, these same survivors will be gathered together before Yahushua to face judgment. He will decide who gets to live during the millennial reign and who doesn't. I have already done a video on this. It's called Who Are the Nations? So that goes into depth about the nations who survived the wrath. So please watch that if you haven't already. It does tie in directly to this Ezekiel passage that we're going to be looking at today. So let's take a look at a couple of verses that show the nations being gathered after the wrath to face judgment face to face with Yahushua. So we'll have a look at Joel 3:1-2 from the New King James Version. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and have divided up my land. Then we've got Matthew 25:31-34. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. He will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So the nations who survive the wrath are brought into the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is called the Valley of Decision, and they are judged. They may not have known Yahushua, but they did help Yahushua's followers. So if you read the rest of Matthew 25, the nations say to Yahushua, When did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And Yahushua says to them, Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. So that means that the nation who showed care and mercy to his people are in effect showing it to him. So these are the nations who will have the opportunity to live during the millennial reign. They will still stay in their mortal bodies. You can see Isaiah 65:17-25, which shows this, and they will still need healing. The leaves of the tree of life are for the healing of the nations, which is described in Revelation 21:2. 2 Baruch 72 mirrors the sheep and the goats judgment. It says, "After the signs have come, of which you were told before, when the nations become turbulent and the time of my Messiah is come, he shall both summon all the nations, and some of them he shall spare, and some of them he shall slay. These things therefore shall come upon the nations which are to be spared by him. Every nation which knows not Israel, and has not trodden down the seed of Jacob, shall indeed be spared. And this because some out of every nation shall be subjected to your people. But all those who have ruled over you or have known you shall be given up to the sword." So we've determined that after Yahushua and Yah return, the nations who survive the wrath will be judged face to face in the valley of decision. So I believe this is exactly the same event that Ezekiel is describing in Ezekiel 20. Most people don't notice it because they just assume that he's talking to Israel. But once we identified who is being gathered and when, then these verses become clear. Okay, so let's go to Ezekiel 20. Now, I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but just to give some context, from verse 1 to 30, Yah is recounting the first exodus from Egypt. And he wants to show how Israel repeatedly rebelled against him. They were turning to idols and disobeying his commandments. And he is just saying that the current generation is repeating the exact same thing. So I understand, because of the context of this chapter and what's said about the Exodus from Egypt, I can see why people think that everything else is related to that. But let's take a look. So verse 30, "Therefore say to the house of Israel." So here Yah is obviously talking to the house of Israel. "Thus says Yahuwah, are you defiling yourselves in the manner of your fathers and committing harlotry according to their abominations? For when you offer your gifts and make your sons pass through the fire, you defile yourselves with all your idols, even to this day. So shall I be inquired of you, O house of Israel. As I live, says Yahuwah, I will not be inquired of by you. What you have in your mind shall never be, when you say, we will be like the Gentiles, like the families in other countries, serving wood and stone." So Yah makes a point a couple of times that he was talking to the whole house of Israel. Okay, so he goes on to say, "As I live, says Yahuwah, surely with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and with fury poured out, I will rule over you. I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you out of the countries where you are scattered, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and with fury poured out. And I will bring you into the wilderness of the peoples, and there I will plead my case with you face to face, just as I pleaded my case with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Egypt, so I will plead my case with you, says Yahuwah. I will make you pass under the rod and bring you into the bond of the covenant. I will purge the rebels from among you and those who transgress against me. I will bring them out of the country where they dwell, but they shall not enter the land of Israel. Then you will know that I am Yahuwah." So yeah, at first glance, I can easily see why people read this as some sort of second Exodus. It does seem like Yah is talking to the Israelites the whole time. It's interesting though, because if you check the Hebrew, the word you in verses 33 to 38, it's not actually there. Every other place in this chapter, this whole chapter, where Yah addresses Israel directly, the Hebrew uses the normal word for you. But in these particular verses, the English translations have added the word you. So it's just an assumption and it's not in the original text. Take a look for yourself. It is a small detail, but it is important to note. But even so, if we isolate this passage, it still seems like Yah is talking to the Israelites because of the terminology that's used. Now, I understand as well when people parallel this prophecy with Revelation 12, where the woman is nourished in the wilderness for a time. If you believe the woman in the wilderness is Israel, then yeah, it does kind of seem to line up. Although Revelation 12 doesn't say anything about testing or purging, so it's not a direct parallel prophecy, even if you do believe that the woman is Israel. Now, I've really done a study on who I believe the woman in the wilderness is, so feel free to watch that video if you haven't already. Also, another thing, the language about mighty hand and outstretched arm, that is similar to verses that we see in Exodus 6, so specifically Exodus 6:6 and Deuteronomy 5:15. So again, it seems like Yah is talking to the Israelites. So I also believed this for a long time myself, but now that I've studied this passage much deeper and I've compared this Ezekiel chapter with other prophetic passages about the end of the world, I can see it differently now. And once all of these prophecies are lined up, it becomes clear that the ones that are being gathered and purged in Ezekiel 20:33-38, it's not Israel. It's the nations, the survivors who remain alive after Yah's wrath is poured out. And I know you're not going to agree straight away, and I don't expect you to, but please stay with me. I can explain it, and let me show you why I've come to this interpretation. So yeah, we'll talk about it. So Ezekiel 20:33 says, "As I live, says Yahuwah, surely with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and with fury poured out, I will rule over you." So this verse is about Yah ruling over a certain people with fury. Okay, it's not the righteous. We're not going to be under Yah's wrath when he returns. He won't rule over us with fury poured out. We're going to reign with him. And scripture says this multiple times. We can see in 2 Timothy 2:12, it says, "If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us." Revelation 5:10 says, "And have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth." Romans 15:12 says, "And again Isaiah says, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he who shall rise to reign over the Gentiles, in him the Gentiles shall hope." Psalm 47 says, "Yah reigns over the nations. Yah sits on his holy throne. He will subdue the people under us and the nations under our feet." So yeah, again, this is just something small, but something that's important to note. When Yah comes, he's not going to be ruling over us with fury, but he will be ruling over the nations, and we will be ruling and reigning with him. Like I mentioned, the phrase "with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm," it is the same language that's used to describe the Exodus from Egypt. So yes, it's valid to see that connection in Ezekiel. But it's also important to realize that this phrasing isn't just about the Exodus of Egypt. It shows up in other places too. And it's a common way that Yah uses to describe his power. It's not always referring to the Exodus. And you can find it in passages describing creation, like in Jeremiah 32:17, and also in the judgment of Babylon in Jeremiah 21:5. So just because that Yah uses the same terminology, the same phrasing in Ezekiel 20 as well as Exodus 6:6 and Deuteronomy, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's talking about the exact same thing. Another reason people often assume Yah is talking to Israel in this passage is in verse 34. It says, "I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you from the countries where you are scattered." So since Israel was scattered among the nations, again, it's natural to assume that this is referring to them. But when you take all the prophecies and end times eschatology into account and you study this verse more deeply, you realize that Israel weren't the only ones who were scattered. I didn't know this myself until I dug into this verse further, so I wonder if anyone else knew that Yah also scattered the nations, not just Israel. The scriptures give multiple examples of Yah judging other nations in the same way that he judged Israel by scattering them. Now, the clearest example is Egypt. Ezekiel 29:12 says, I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them throughout the countries. In Ezekiel 30:23, Yah repeats it again, I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them throughout the countries. Then again, in verse 26, I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them throughout the countries, and then they shall know that I am Yahuwah. So the same judgment that Israel experienced, so exile, dispersion, and becoming a people without their land, this also happened to Egypt. So the scattering language in Ezekiel 20 is not necessarily exclusive to Israel, because we also see the same phrase used in Jeremiah 49:36, where Yah says he will scatter the Elamites. So this just means that the term scattering can be used as a judgment pattern, and it's not an Israel-only identity marker. Okay, so now I just want to focus on the part in Ezekiel 20 where it says that Yah will bring the people he is addressing to the wilderness of the peoples. Some translations, so the Septuagint says the wilderness of the nations. And there he will plead his case face to face. He even adds, just as I pleaded my case with your fathers in the wilderness, so I will plead my case with you. Again, the English word with you has been added. So Yah says, so will I plead my case. So when Yah says that, he's using legal terminology because this is talking about judgment. When he says he will plead his case, it means that he will state his charges and his arguments directly against the people who he's talking about. This isn't about a test in the wilderness. It's a direct face-to-face judgment. So I'm just going to read a couple more verses that just show that Yah is going to judge the nations. And when I say judge, I'm not talking about throwing them just in the lake of fire or coming to destroy them at Yahushua's second coming. I mean sitting on a throne of judgment and judging them face to face. And again, not talking about the white throne judgment either. There is the judgment in the valley of Jehoshaphat. So that is the judgment that I'm specifically addressing. So what I'm putting forward is that this specific passage in Ezekiel 20 is speaking of the nation's judgment. And in this context, I believe it's specifically referring to Egypt. So I'll just show you some more corresponding scriptures. So Yah says, just as I pleaded my case with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Egypt, so I will plead my case with you. And again, I completely understand why people assume this is Israel, because if we isolate this verse, it seems so obvious, doesn't it, that it's talking about the Israelites. And it seems like it doesn't even need to be studied any deeper. But if we go to Jeremiah 25, Yah is talking to many nations here. Jeremiah is prophesying about the judgment of lots of different nations, including Egypt, specifically the Pharaoh of Egypt and all of his people. So Jeremiah uses the same terminology as Ezekiel. In verse 31, it says, a noise will come to the ends of the earth, for Yahuwah has a controversy with the nations. He will plead his case with all flesh. He will give those who are wicked to the sword, says Yahuwah. So again, pleading his case, it means bringing charges against someone. Again, Yah is a judge. He's going to be speaking in this kind of legal terminology. So here, Jeremiah is prophesying judgment to the nations, including Egypt. Now, Ezekiel 29 is the fulfillment of this prophecy. Ezekiel 29, 2-5 says, Son of man, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and prophesy against him and against all of Egypt. Speak and say, Thus says Yahuwah, Behold, I am against you, O Pharaoh, king of Egypt, O great monster who lies in the midst of the rivers, who has said, My river is my own, I have made it for myself. but I will put hooks in your jaws and cause the fish of your rivers to stick to your scales. And I will bring you out of the midst of your rivers, and all the fish in your rivers will stick to your scales. I will leave you in the wilderness, you and all the fish of your rivers. You shall fall on the open field. You shall not be picked up or gathered. I have given you as food to the beasts of the field and to the birds of the heavens. Now here's the connection that I want to make. In Ezekiel 20, Yah says, just as I pleaded my case with your fathers in the wilderness. The fathers, I believe he's referring to, are the ancestors of those nations, the same ones mentioned in Jeremiah 25, where Yah has a controversy with the nations and will plead his case with all flesh, including Egypt. Then I believe this is fulfilled in Ezekiel 29, where the Pharaoh and all of his people are judged and left in the wilderness. Jeremiah 16:19-21 mentions what the nations will say about their fathers in the last days. O Yahuwah, my strength and my fortress, my refuge in the day of affliction, the Gentiles shall come to you from the ends of the earth and say, surely our fathers have inherited lies, worthlessness and unprofitable things. Will a man make gods for himself which are not gods? Therefore, behold, I will this once cause them to know. I will cause them to know my hand and my might, and they shall know that my name is Yahuwah. And notice what he says there as well. He says, I cause them to know my hand and my might, meaning his authority and his power. And in Ezekiel 20, it says he will rule over them with his mighty hand. It's the same thing. Ezekiel verse 37-38 says, I will make you pass under the rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. I will purge the rebels from among you, and those who transgress against me. I will bring them out of the country where they dwell, but they shall not enter the land of Israel. Then you will know that I am Yahuwah. Again, if you look at this verse in isolation, it's assumed and people teach that we will be taken into a wilderness and tested, and that the rebels will be purged before anyone can enter into the kingdom. Now the problem with this idea is that it adds a caveat to salvation. The passage itself doesn't even mention a test at all. What it describes here when Yah says he's going to plead his case, that's a judgment. It's a face-to-face, direct confrontation with Yah. It's not a proving ground. I believe verse 37 is a reference to Leviticus 27, where people would go to an Israelite priest to dedicate themselves, either themselves or their land or their flock, to Yah. The priest would then assign a value to what was being dedicated, and the person would make a vow and consecrate themselves to Yah. Please read that full chapter, Leviticus 27. Now, in the Septuagint translation of Ezekiel 20, the verse reads, and I will cause you to pass under my rod and bring you in by number. Likewise, Leviticus 27 in the Septuagint says, and every tithe of oxen and of sheep and whatever may come in numbering under the rod, the 10th shall be holy to the Lord. So we can see here the direct correlation between Ezekiel 20:37 and then Leviticus 27. So in Leviticus, the animals were passed under the rod to be counted and dedicated. Here, both passages, I believe, are speaking of the same idea. So the nations, the sheep being, chosen in the sheep and the goat's judgment, they will pass under the rod. As Yahusha has been given all authority to judge, he will judge the nations and bring the faithful sheep in by number. And those sheep, meaning the nations that were chosen, they will then dedicate themselves to Yah with a vow. Then the goats, in contrast, they will be removed, just as it says in Matthew 25. So the purging in Ezekiel 20 is not a purging of the Israelites, it's a purging of the ungodly nations, the goats in the sheep and the goats judgment. Also, the priestly imagery between Leviticus 27 and Ezekiel 20, it fits perfectly as well. In Leviticus 27, it's the priest who brings in these people by number, and the people dedicate and consecrate themselves to Yah with the priest. So we know that Yahusha is our high priest, and he will bring the nations in by number, passing them under the rod and counting those who are righteous among the nations. They come into the bond of the covenant and they make a vow to Yah. And we also see this in Isaiah 19:19-21. It says, "In that day there will be an altar to Yahuwah in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to Yahuwah at its border." So obviously this hasn't happened yet. This is end times. There is no pillar to Yahuwah. There's no altar to Yahuwah in the midst of the land of Egypt. And it says, "And it will be for a sign and for a witness to Yahuwah in the land of Egypt, for they will cry to Yahuwah because of their oppressors. And he will send them a savior and a mighty one, and he will deliver them. Then Yahuwah will be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know Yahuwah in that day, and will make a sacrifice and an offering. Yes, they will make a vow to Yahuwah and perform it." And you see how all of these verses fit together with the context of everything in, the Old Testament, priestly duties, consecration, how people give themselves and dedicate themselves to Yah. It's not just isolating one verse and then running with it. What we should be doing when we study the Bible is looking at all of these different prophecies and seeing the similarities and the context behind all of them. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this judgment of the nations is going to be in the valley of Jehoshaphat, the valley of decision. It's going to be in a literal place, and the Bible tells us exactly where it is. We see in Joel 3:11-14, it says, "Assemble and come, all you nations, and gather together all around. Cause your mighty ones to go down there, O Yahuwah. Let the nations be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit and judge all the surrounding nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, go down, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of Yahuwah is near in the valley of decision." The valley mentioned in Joel 3, where Yah gathers the nations for judgment, could be, and I'm not saying this for definite, but it could be the same valley described in Zechariah 14:4, when the Mount of Olives is split. I think all of these passages point to the same place, which is the judgment when Yahusha and Yah return. Zechariah 14:4-5 says, "And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split into two from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move towards the north, and half of it toward the south. Then you shall flee through my mountain valley, for the mountain valley shall reach Azal. Yes, you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Thus says Yahuwah, my God will come, and all the saints with you." So this isn't talking to us. We're not going to be fleeing in any valley. We're going to be protected from the wrath. I believe this is talking to the nations who will be surviving Yah's wrath. Now, if you read verse 10, it says, "All the land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem." Now, that word plain, if you look it up in the concordance, it could also be translated as the same word for wilderness, which is interesting because doesn't Ezekiel 20 say that he's going to bring them into the wilderness of the nations? See how it lines up? It's not only Israel that ever has gone into a wilderness. The nations are brought into the valley, which turns into a wilderness, an open plain. Wilderness doesn't always mean a desert, like kind of what we imagine the wilderness to be. It could just be a place that's uninhabited by people. New Jerusalem is called a wilderness. or it can just be an open pasture. It's just an open place. So there are lots of different definitions of the word. The exact same Hebrew word is translated to lots of different things depending on what the English translator wanted to change the word to. So don't let the term wilderness make you think that it's just one specific thing and that only the Israelites have ever gone into the wilderness, because it's just not true. So when we read Ezekiel 20 with this context, everything fits perfectly. It aligns with the end times judgment and the establishment of Yah's kingdom on earth, which is the true promised land. Now, one final thing to note, the restoration promise is not just for Israel. The prophets repeatedly said that other nations will also return to Yah and worship him. And this only happens during the millennial reign. So Isaiah 19:22-25, and Yahuwah will strike Egypt. He will strike and heal it, and they will return to Yah. And he will be entreated by them and will heal them. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian will come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians. In that day Israel will be one of three, with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land, whom Yahuwah shall bless, saying, Blessed is Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. Zechariah 14:16-19 says, And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, on them there will be no rain. If the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain, and they shall receive the plague which Yahuwah strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt, and the punishment of all the nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, so after walking through all of this, here is the takeaway. So I believe Ezekiel 20:33-38 is not speaking to Israel. It's speaking about the nations, specifically those who survive Yah's wrath, and possibly maybe specifically Egypt. Right before this passage, Yah says to the Israelites, What you have in your mind shall never be, when you say, We will be like the Gentiles, like the families in other countries, serving wood and stone. So that's in verse 32. So because Israel expressed a desire to be like the nations, I believe Yah immediately shifts the focus to what will happen to those nations. We see the language of Yah pleading his case face to face, which points to his judgment, a direct face-to-face judgment. The imagery of the wilderness, the rod, and the bond of the covenant perfectly connects with the priestly county and dedication in Leviticus 27. And we know, as I said, Yahusha is our high priest, and he will bring in the righteous nations by number, and then the unrighteous nations are removed. Again, just like the sheep and the goats judgment. Now the prophets, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Baruch, Joel, Zechariah, all of them, they consistently show this same event, but from different perspectives. So the prophecies, they're not isolated. No prophecies are. They're all connected throughout all of Scripture. So I'm just going to quickly reread this verse and explain what we've gone over. So Yah says, As I live, says Yahuwah, surely with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and with fury poured out, I will rule over you. So we've come to the understanding that Yah isn't going to rule over us with wrath and fury and power. He's going to rule over the nations, and we are going to rule with him. He says, I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you from the countries where you are scattered, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and with fury poured out. So we've come to the realization that it's not just the Israelites that have been scattered. Lots of different nations have been scattered as well, but specifically, I believe this is talking about Egypt. And Yah says, I will bring you into the wilderness of the peoples. So again, the wilderness of the nations, and not necessarily meaning the desolate land wilderness, but the open plain, the judgment site, the valley that's going to be split and turned into a wilderness, an open plain. And there I will plead my case with you face to face. So there, Yah is going to, or Yahusha, because Yahusha's been given the judgment, Yahusha's going to enter into judgment face to face with these people, which I believe is the judgment of the valley of Jehoshaphat, the valley of decision. Just as I pleaded my case with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Egypt. We saw in the Jeremiah and the Ezekiel verse that Yah pleaded his case with Pharaoh in Egypt. I will make you pass under the rod and will bring you into the bond of the covenant. And I think this is undeniably talking about the priestly duties of people dedicating, consecrating, and giving a vow to Yah, and he will bring them into the bond of the covenant. Or the Septuagint says he will bring them in by number. Again, links to Leviticus 27, where the priest counts the sheep in, or counts the herd in by number. It says, I will purge the rebels from among you and those who transgress against me, and they shall not enter the land of Israel. So we know the land of Israel is going to be Yah's promised land. The sheep and the goat's judgment, the sheep will be chosen by Yahusha to live during the millennial reign and have the opportunity to approach Yah's temple, the outer court of the temple, which Ezekiel describes in Ezekiel's chapters 40 to 48. They won't be allowed right in the temple, but they can be on the outer courts, while the unrighteous, the goats, are destroyed. We see the terminology that pleading the case doesn't mean a testing ground. Nowhere does it say that we will be gathered into a place and tested. And a lot of people are using this testing of the wilderness and the second Exodus to be gathered into the wilderness and be tested as some sort of promise that Yah is going to promise that he will do this. And then they link it again to the Israelites being tested in the wilderness in Exodus. Now, I just want to remind you, the testing of the Israelites in the wilderness was not a promise. That was a punishment. So are we saying that Yah is going to promise to punish us? We cannot link those two events together and say that this is Yah's promise. Yah has promised the same thing to every single prophet from Genesis to Revelation, including all those outside books. The promise is eternal life. The promise is resurrection. The promise is the gathering of every single Israelite, every single faithful Israelite, including Adam and Eve. Like, they're going to be gathered at the same time as those who are still going to be alive during that time. But I'm going to go into much more detail on that on a second video that I'm going to do, which is basically another video about the second Exodus as a whole, not specifically this Ezekiel chapter. I'm not going to bring up this Ezekiel chapter in that video because I have specifically focused on it in this one. So please look out for that video. That should be coming out soon. I believe that verse 39 in Ezekiel 20 confirms that Yah wasn't talking to the Israelites and that he was speaking to the nations, or at least not speaking to the Israelites. Because verse 39 says, and as for you, O house of Israel, so it shows that in the earlier verses, the focus wasn't on Israel. Again, I know this probably is different from what you've been taught and how you've read these Ezekiel verses before, but I hope this study has at least helped you see a different perspective. And it does align with end times eschatology, and that judgment and restoration extend beyond Israel. Now, Yah's kingdom come will be a blessing to all who dwell on the earth, and out of Zion, his Torah will go forth to all nations. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this study. I pray the Most High blesses and keeps you all.